Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So, on today's episode, I've got a $40 deck tech for you on, well, one of the best partner pairs of all time because it includes one of the bestest boys of all time, and I guess his owner as well. But yeah, anyways, let's jump into it. So the ground rules for my deck techs are as follows. The budget is $50 or less, and that's an overall deck cost. So that cost includes shipping as well as commanders as long as they're $10 or less, but basic lands will not be included in that price. On my deck techs, I'm going to take you through the strategy, the tactics, and how the deck wins. So today's episode is actually a patron-selected deck tech. Once a month, patrons vote on what commander that they'd like to see in an upcoming episode. The commander that gets the most votes wins. And the commander that they chose was the partner commanders of Halden and Paco. Halden Avid Arcanist is a 1/4 human wizard that costs 2 and a blue. You may play non-creature cards from exile with fetch counters on them if you exile them, and you may spend mana as though it were any color to cast those spells. And then Paco Arcane Retriever is a 3/3 elemental hound that costs 3 red-green. He has haste, and whenever he attacks, exile the top card of each player's library and put a fetch counter on each of them. Put a +1/+1 counter onto Paco for each non-creature card exiled this way. So in combination, these two commanders can help provide you a lot of card advantage. They give you access to non-creature spells off the top of your own library and your opponent's as well. So the strategy for this deck is pretty straightforward. We're going to control the top of our own library and our opponent's libraries as well. With this kind of a deck, we're going to work to try to hit the best non-creature spells that we can. And then how do we win with this deck? We're going to win with our opponent's spells or commander damage. Our opponents might have some really powerful non-creature spells for us to steal, or we can just make Paco big and smack everyone in the face. And as always, I'm going to take you through 10 different tactics to show you how this deck works and how we're going to win. So let's start things off with tactic number 1, fetch. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 and tap and sacrifice to get a basic land into play tapped. Next up, there's Fawn of Fertility, which is an enchantment that essentially does the exact same thing for 1 and a green. Next up, there's Search for Tomorrow, which is a fantastic turn 1 play since it has to spend 2 for a green. It says, search your library for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. And then we're not running very many creatures in this deck, but Steve is one of them. We can sacrifice a Kura Tribe Elder to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. And then we've got some other great turn 2 plays with Rampant Growth, Edge of Autumn, and Farseek. Rampant Growth is going to get us 1 basic land into play tapped. Edge of Autumn does the exact same thing if we've got 4 or less lands, and we can cycle it by sacrificing a land. And then Farseek is going to get us an island or mountain into play tapped. Next up, we've got Explorer, which is going to let us play 1 additional land this turn and draw us a card. And then Growth Spiral is similar, but it's also at instant speed. Next up, there's Harrow, which makes us sacrifice 1 basic to get 2 into play untapped. And then Cultivate gets us 1 basic into play tapped and 1 into our hand. Grow from the Ashes gets us 1 basic into play untapped or 2 if we kicked it. Next up, there's Circuitous Route, which gets us 2 basics and or gate cards into play tapped. And finally, there's Migration Path, which gets us 2 basics into play tapped, or we can cycle it for 2. We're running a decent amount of ramp in this deck, and we're not quite done ramping just yet. So now let's move on to tactic number 2, a little off the top. First up, there's Explorer Scope, which says, whenever a quick creature attacks, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped. So this helps us out in 2 different ways. When we attack with Paco, we can stack this trigger first. So if there's a land on top, we get to ramp ourselves, then also we're getting rid of a dead card. The next card below it could be a non-creature spell to give us even more card advantage. So we're also running Into the Wilds, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield. So obviously this one helps us out in similar ways, although combat isn't involved. Speaking of combat though, how do we make sure Paco survives it? So now it's time for us to move on to tactic number 3, coming through. First up, there's Key to the City, which we can tap to discard a card, and up to 1 target creature can't be blocked this turn. On top of that, whenever this becomes untapped, we can pay 2, and if we do, we draw a card. So this can essentially make Paco unblockable, and it can help us loot. And then we're running Prowler's Helm, which says equipped creature can't be blocked except by walls, and most people don't run walls, so it's basically just unblockable. Next up, there's Whisperspoke Cloak, which says equipped creature can't be blocked and has Shroud. So this protects Paco in multiple ways. And finally, we're going to be running Aqueous Swarm, which says enchanted creature can't be blocked, and whenever enchanted creature attacks, scry 1. So this not only gets Paco through, but also helps us set the top card of our library. Now, knowing what the top card of our library is can be very important for this deck. So let's go through some other cards that can help with this, and other things too, in tactic number 4, Insightful. And first up, we've actually got the golden pick of this deck, which is the number 1 card out of our 99. And the golden pick for this deck is Lantern of Insight. It's an artifact that costs 1 and it says each player plays with the top card of their library revealed. And then by tapping and sacrificing it, target player shuffles their library. This card gives us perfect information on what is on top of every player's library. And for this kind of a deck, that's obviously incredibly useful information. We not only know what players are going to draw, but we also know what Paco is going to hit. And we'll go through the cards later, but we've also got some ways to manipulate the top card of the library. This is an extremely cheap way to give us perfect information, and that's what makes it the Golden Pig. A slightly more costly card that does the exact same thing is Wizened Snitches. Again, we're not running many creatures in this deck, but it's worth running this one. And next up, there's Wand of Denial, which has tap, look at the top card of target player's library. If it's a non-land card, you may pay 2 life. If you do, put it into that player's graveyard. So this can help us know what the top card is and potentially get rid of it if we don't want it. Then there's Psychic Surgery, which has whenever an opponent shuffles their library, you may look at the top 2 cards of that library. You may exile one of those cards, then put the rest on top of that library in any order. There are going to be plenty of times throughout the game where an opponent's going to be shuffling their library. When they do, this can help us set the top card and know what it is. And finally, we've got 2 ways to look at the top card of our own library with Lens of Clarity and Precognition Field. Lens of Clarity says you may look at the top card of your library and at face down creatures you don't control. And then Precognition Field says you may look at the top card of your library, you may cast the top card of your library if it's an instant or sorcery card, and you can pay 3 and exile the top card of your library. So this can let us cast things off the top as well as get rid of things if we don't need them. But we've got plenty of other ways to take out the top card. So now let's move on to tactic number 5, Next. First up, there's Goldcaller's Bell, which we can tap, and each player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. And then Pyxis of Pandemonium pretty much does the exact same thing, but it exiles them. Each of these are great in combination with something like Lantern of Insight. Next up, there's Codex Shredder, which can tap to mill 1 player for 1. On top of that, we can pay 5 and tap and sacrifice it to return target card from our graveyard to our hand. And then Grind Clock has tap, put a charge counter on Grind Clock, and tap target player mills X cards where X is the number of charge counters on Grind Clock. Next up, there's Sands of Delirium, which has pay X and tap it, target player mills X cards. And then there's Precognition, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may look at the top card of target opponent's library. If you do, you may put that card onto the bottom of that player's library. So with this, we can essentially Fate Seal each turn. And although Think Tank doesn't say it, it's essentially at the beginning of your upkeep, Surveil 1. Next up, there's Eyes Everywhere, which is similar. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, Scry 1. And we can also pay 5 and a blue and exchange control of Eyes Everywhere and target non-land permanent, but we can only do this anytime we can cast a sorcery. And then Darksteel Pendant is indestructible, and we can pay 1 and tap it to Scry 1. Finally, there's Crystal Ball, which we can pay 1 and tap to Scry 2. Again, being able to manipulate the tops of libraries, including our own, is huge for this deck. But we've also got some other cards that can help as well. So it's time for us to move on to tactic number 6, Think Deep. First up, there's Frantic Search, which says draw 2, then discard 2, untap up to 3 lands. And then Fact or Fiction says reveal the top 5 cards of your library, and opponent separates those cards into 2 piles, put one of those piles into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Next up, there's Song of Creation, which does a lot for us. It says you may play an additional land on each of your turns. Whenever you cast a spell, draw 2 cards, at the beginning of your end step, discard your hand. Now that last part actually isn't that big of a deal because we essentially have a separate hand because of Paco. So the positives definitely outweigh the negatives in this. And then there's Trinket Mage, which lets us tutor for an artifact with a converted mana cost of 1. And with this deck, we've got a ton of those, including our Golden Pig. Next up, there's Brainstorm, which says draw 3 cards and put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. Finally, there's Portent, which says look at the top 3 cards of target player's library, then put them back in any order. You may have that player shuffle their library, draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So this lets us get the right card on top of one player's library. Now we've got a lot of great cards in this deck, and what happens when we need one back? So now it's time for us to move on to tactic number 7, Back on Top. First up, there's Reclaim, which says put target card from your graveyard on top of your library. And then Once in Future says return target card from your graveyard to your hand, put up to 1 other target card from your graveyard on top of your library, exile Once in Future. And if at least 3 green mana was spent to cast this spell, instead we get both those cards back to our hand. Regardless, each of these being able to get something back on top can be really effective with Paco. But we're also running some mass recursion spells though with Wildest Dreams and Reap the Past. Wildest Dreams says return X target cards from your graveyard to your hand, exile Wildest Dreams. And then Reap the Past says return X cards at random from your graveyard to your hand, exile Reap the Past. So if we want to get a ton of cards back, each of these can be a fantastic way to do that. Now we've talked about getting ourselves set up, but how do we deal with our opponent's things? It's time for us to move on to tactic number 8, Into Thin Air. First up, there's Return to Nature, which says choose 1, destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, or exile target card from your graveyard. And then Broken Bond says destroy target artifact or enchantment, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Next up, we've got Deglamour and Unravel the Aether, which do the exact same thing. They say choose target artifact or enchantment, its owner shuffles it into their library. And then Expel Vraska has Ascend, and it says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If you have the city's blessing, you may put that permanent on top of its owner's library instead. In combination with Paco, we can essentially steal some incredibly powerful non-creature permanents. So we've also got some similar cards with Temporal Spring, Vanishment, and Commit to Memory. Temporal Spring is going to put target permanent on top of its owner's library. Vanishment says put target non-land permanent on top of its owner's library, and it's got Miracle for blue. And then Commit says put target spell or non-land permanent into its owner's library, second from the top. Memory has Aftermath and says each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7 cards. But these aren't the only ways that we can throw a wrench into our opponent's plans. So now it's time for us to move on to tactic number 9, Hindrance. First up, there's Memory Lapse, which says counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, put it on top of its owner's library instead of into that player's graveyard. So this is a really effective way to set ourselves up to steal a card with Pako. And Hinder is somewhat similar. It lets us choose to put that card on top or on the bottom of its owner's library. And finally, we're running Negate, which is just going to straight up counter target non-creature spell. Now, like I mentioned before, we can win with our opponent's things, but we can also just win with Pako. So now let's move on to our final tactic, tactic number 10, Bark and Bite. First up, there's Relentless Assault, which says untap all creatures that attack this turn. After this main phase, there's additional combat phase, followed by additional main phase. So essentially, we double the attacks, doubling the damage, and doubling the card advantage. And speaking of doubling, we're also running Unleash Fury, which says double the power of target creature until end of turn. It doesn't take long to get enough counters on Pako to make this into a one-shot kill. So we're also going to be running some double strike spells with Psychotic Fury, Temur Battle Rage, and Blood Mist. Psychotic Fury says target multicolored creature gains double strike until end of turn, and it's going to draw us a card. And Temur Battle Rage is going to get Pako double strike, and in most cases, also trample. And finally, Blood Mist is an enchantment, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gains double strike until end of turn. A one-shot kill from the bestest of boys is always a good time. But now let's see how this deck stacks up when it comes to cost, so it's time to go on to a price breakdown. The average Haldan and Pako EDH Rec deck is going to set you back $374.70. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at $40.40. And with all that money that you're going to be saving, let's move on to some reasonable upgrades. First up, let's add in Tali Primal Storm by taking out Once in Future. Next up, let's add in Stolen Tragedy by taking out Return to Nature. And then let's add in Serenic Resonator by taking out Wildest Dreams. Next up, let's add in Seize the Day by taking out Temur Battle Rage. And then let's add in World at War by taking out Unleash Fury. Finally, let's add in Noxious Revival by taking out Reap the Past. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are. Do you think Pako is one of the bestest boys of all time? So yeah, let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks again and have a good one.